Di Kellen, Charlotte Young, Sonia Richard, Din Camelvin, Sama Hennon, Tracy Thornton. A special mention to Shelby Woodman and Richard Gabaton, who are PIPS liaisons. These people have been working nonstop, initiating programs to better serve the membership, and I applaud them. I would like to introduce Din Cameldon, the chair of the PIPS Black Caucus, to say a few words. Din? Um, okay, maybe.
I'm sorry, I had to rejoin. I got cut off. Thank you, Jenny. Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy and I'm so excited for this caucus to be underway. I'd like to give um, thanks to my allies in the GTA area. I'd like to thank Joel Reisman for working with me over the years, for representing our Black employees with issues with management. I'd like to thank the Ontario region for allowing me to bring up these issues and also supporting me to strongly advocate for anti-Black racism. I'd like to say the roots of anti-Black racism and systemic discrimination run deep. They're historically embedded in the society, culture, in the laws, in the attitudes. They're built into institution and sustain the social and economic disparities. Racist acts, no matter how subtle, must no longer be ignored or tolerated in Canada. Even the most subtle and microaggression forms of racism contribute to the conditions that permit overt racism to occur. Thank you, and I pass you back to Jenny.
Thank you so much, Din. Today, I would like to welcome two incredible activists in the Black community who will discuss and analyze how systemic racism impacts Black families and communities and identify concrete ways in which the Canadian labor movement can assist in combating anti-Black racism. I'd also like to introduce my partner in crime, Richard Gabaldon, who will be our moderator for this session. Please, Richard.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, everyone, for being here, taking the time to have this discussion with us today. Basically, the way that the webinar is going to go is very simple. We will have a presentation from our two guests, and following that, you'll be able to ask questions using the chat at the bottom of your screen. And luckily, I have two great colleagues, Shelley from Mobilization and Andrea from Communication, who are going to help me gather, harvest your questions and give them to me so I can ask them to our guest. Obviously, we may not have the time to go through all the questions. However, all the questions, the remaining questions from the French sessions that was last week, and the questions, the remaining questions from this session, we'll gather them. And Larry and Emilie have already accepted to go through maybe the more recurrent ones and provide you with some answers. And Communication will help us post them probably on the website. We're going to see how it's going to happen, but do not worry. So I invite you to ask as many questions as you can, so you can truly understand what we're talking about today. All right, so I will introduce our first guest. And our first guest is Emilie Nicolas. I'll give Emilie the time to show herself. Emilie. So Emilie is an award-winning human rights advocate, anthropologist, and consultant. She has contributed to various organizations in Canada and internationally. She is currently a columnist at the respectable journal Le Devoir and also political commentator on CBC's Power and Politics and CTV's Power Play. Also, she's appointed by the Government of Canada to oversee the orientation of the Canadian Race Relation Foundation, which is a federal crown corporation, and she's contributing in research and educational materials on issues of racism across Canada. One thing, so you know who Emilie, the type of person Emilie is. Before doing this webinar, usually you check with your guest, what do you want me to say about you, like for your bio? And Emilie was like, nah, I don't need anything. So what I gathered from that, basically my interpretation was basically, fame and glory doesn't matter. We gotta get the work done, move over so I can start educating people. So without further ado, Emilie, welcome.
Thank you. Are you introducing Larry next, or what does? Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm gonna mute myself then. But it's nice to be here. Thank you for the welcome.
No. Basically, I'll do Larry after your presentation, like the French.
Okay. Sorry about that. There's a little bit of a confusion on how we're proceeding. Thank you so much for having me, Richard and Jennie and everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here. There's a lot of really big questions that are asked in the description of this event. And so there's obviously no way that we can discuss and answer everything. But perhaps I want to start today with something that just happened this week in Quebec that I think is a great example of systemic racism. There's a young Indigenous woman, she's 37 years old, George Echapan, who just passed away on Monday night in the hospital in Joliette, just north of Montreal. She was a mother of 7, and she had some chronic heart condition. And it was in her file that she could not have morphine. The hospital staff ignored that. And she actually had been on the receiving end of racism in the hospitals before. And so she had developed the habit of filming herself when she interacted with staff, kind of like a lot of people are now filming themselves when they interact with the police. And so she did that, and so it started. This video of her went viral online over the last couple of days, and you can clearly hear the staff saying that she's no good. She's only good to have babies and have sex, and that she's so stupid and she should just shut up. That we pay for her, like, does she know who pays for her? And so there's a whole bunch of racist cliches that are being sold. And then she passes away a couple hours after that. When her family tried to call the hospital, when they saw the Facebook Live, the hospital hung up on them, so they didn't have a chance to actually understand what was going on, or to speak or see her before she passed away. And also you see the nurse trying to delete the video when she sees that she's still filming, actually. So somebody has saved the video already, but you see that like the hospital's first reaction was to actually trying to delete the evidence of their racism. And so that just started a conversation here that is hard for me to set aside. As I'm doing a, kind of abstract presentation of systemic racism. And that I think is one of the things that it's important to understand about this topic, is that it's not just okay, here's this concept. It's very much a lived experience, and you never know when it's gonna pop up and take over our lives. You never know when or how it's going to affect our lives. So there was a vigil last night in Joliette in the parking lot of the hospital. There's a protest that's planned this Saturday. But it's just one of the ways, the reason why an incident like that triggers so many reactions, it's because beyond the incident, it's also about how it just reminds everyone of their own experience of racism in the healthcare system, and in other forms, you know, either like sterilization or children being taken away, just all the violence and family destruction that happened in the history of this country in hospitals for Indigenous peoples. But not only, I've also just received, I'm actually working, one of the stories that I'm working on is stories of sterilization of Black women actually in Montreal over the last couple of years, so not in the distant past. And so whenever something like that happens, you see it's not just that's the systemic part of it, right? Is that all the trauma, all the memories, all the collective histories that are in the communities that are affected by racism just come up at the surface. And so this is why when you have something like that happens, the gravity of it is never only just what happened, although in and of itself, a mother like that dying is absolutely tragic. It's also everybody else lived history and trauma, unhealed trauma, bubbling up at the surface on one hand. And on the other hand, it's also the denial and the response of the premier and the response of the health minister and other people in charge who are just, you know, either saying polite statement, but you're not necessarily seeing the result. And that's also in a way re-traumatizing. Whenever you speak about systemic racism, you need to deal with the incident that was just lived, but you also need to live, there's this additional layer of either denial or just unsatisfying response that makes you see that basically your life is not worth enough, right? And so that's just one incident that just happened this week. Another incident that happened this week is actually you're starting to see migrant workers. I'm aware of at least 2 cases, Black people who don't have a permanent status in Canada and who are being detained and threatened with deportation, although they have jobs as essential workers. And so one of the cases that just surfaced, his name is Mamadou, and he was working in the CHSLD, what we call in Quebec the long-term care house services for elders. And he was working there as a person who was doing the cleaning. And so he wasn't attending to the elders himself. And so as a result of that, he's actually excluded from this very, very narrow program that Justin Trudeau and François Legault finally agreed on after a lot of pressure to regularize the status of some of those Black immigrants. And so, so people like himself are just actually in prison right now at the detention center for immigrants in Laval, about to be deported. So on one hand, you say, you know, you have a whole country that says Black Lives Matter, we're not like the United States, on one hand. On the other hand, you have basically Black people who've risked their lives for us, who are treated as disposable and are about to be deported in countries where in this first case, the guys from Ivory Coast, when there's an election that's about to happen and there's risk of political trouble, and that's one of the reasons he fled the country, is because being involved in political trouble. So there's actually risk for him if he's being deported. And so those are just 2 things that just came up on the radar today, that you understand basically in those things how basically an individual act of either racism or just carelessness or neglect is actually embedded into a system that basically treats some of our lives as more disposable than others. And that's basically what systemic racism is, right? It's the historical construction in Canada that makes it that white people matter more than the others, politically, socially, economically. One of the definition that I heard that I find the most helpful of systemic racism is basically, it's just a system of distribution of capital, basically political capital, capital in terms of money, but also social capital. Basically, it's a system in place to make sure that overall the accumulation of capital will be largely in the hand of the people in the privileged majority, in the white majority, basically. And that's something that you can see that happened historically over the history of this country. So that means, you know, from the days of Johnny McDonald and all of that, but even before that, the very gesture of coming here, planting a cross and saying this land belongs to the king of whatever, in and of itself, is based on the idea that people who are here don't use the territory properly, or they're not necessarily people. And so the fact that this is how the Americas was founded in and of itself shows that systemic racism embedded in the foundation of the country in terms of indigenous people. And then on that you have anti-Black racism, which is basically based in the idea that you need to have other people, you know, work for you for free. And in order to justify that exploitation, you need to dehumanize those people and try to find a doctrine that justifies the fact that you can treat these people as not people, basically as chattel. And that's also something that's in place from Argentina to Canada, basically all over the Americas. And we are no exception in this as well. There are some countries in which the plantation economy and all of that was very much the main foundation of the colonial system. Here, it's interesting. A lot of people will say that slavery in Canada was not as bad because it wasn't such. While when you look at it, the fact that it was mostly, you know, let's put it this way, leisure slavery, or slavery that was happening for fun because it was fashionable to have slaves in the bourgeois households of either New France or in Upper Canada, in what is now Ontario, or Nova Scotia. You know, it's a little bit absurd to think of that as something that's milder when you're actually, there's no economic necessity for slavery. It just happened because people liked to enslave Black people. You know, let that sink in. And so when you look at that history, and what I do usually in presentation is I go over in a lot of details all the different, you know, prime ministers and the different steps in this country that basically resulted into everybody who's not white being disenfranchised for a very, very long period of time, which creates now this kind of culture where everybody that's not white is deemed to be new or question whether or not they belong, right? The where are you from, where are you from that always comes up as basically being existing by design in a basically a political structure that's there to say that white people are settlers and they're the preferred subjects of the crown, and they're there to properly occupy the land and make sure that it's economically profitable in their, you know, and it's the way that it's being exploited and the economic activities that we choose to put forward. And then everybody else is just, if there's cheap labor needed, you're there, but you're also very much interchangeable and disposable. And when you're not needed anymore, you can go back home, or we don't know exactly what to do with you, but you're still not going to be an equal. And that's very much the history of Black people in this country, and certainly the Chinese community as well, historically. And then Indigenous people who are kind of in the way of this possession of the land as well. And so, so you see the impact of that in all the different systems of our society, which is healthcare, education, employment, you know, work, and obviously the unions are not an exception to that at all. And there's been actually a history within the union movement in Canada of trying to basically exclude Black people from unions, because if you negotiate with them in, and might actually lower the working, you know, the wages and the work condition for the white people who are trying to get ahead, right, and trying to not associate themselves with people who are less desirable. And so that history is part of the union movement as well. And there is no way to deny that either. And so I'm sorry if I'm making a presentation in a way that's very gloomy, but there's just, you know, there's such a lot of emergency around us right now in this right? It's, I mean, we've just also, I don't know if some of you have watched the debate, the US debate that happened last night, but there's a lot going on. You know, the President of the United States just said to a bunch of white supremacists, you know, stand by, right? Be ready. And so I don't think we have the luxury to just quietly learn about those issues. We need to learn about those issues while being very conscious of the fact that action is needed now, and we need to also like be ready to act. It's like there's a war basically upon us, and we need to enroll militia, but get them trained really fast. In a way, that's how it feels. It feels the issue of racism is very much alive and urgent right now. And not only do we need everyone to be on board, understand what it is and how to fight, but also be ready to fight yesterday. So I'll leave it at that for now. And I'm looking forward to the question period.
Thank you, Emilie. It's so true. And what we've seen in the media and the poor indigenous women dying in the hospital like that, treated like that, you can't believe these things are still happening, but they are. And that's why we're here. That's why we're having this discussion. I just want to ask you, Emilie, like when you come back, there might be noise around you, I don't know, because we're trying to figure out where some noise is coming from. So I'll go on with Larry. I don't know if Larry, you can show yourself. Yes, Larry. Oh, wearing the orange t-shirt. Yes. Hi, Larry. So thank you for being here. Larry, basically, for those who don't know Larry, Larry is the vice president. He was elected at CLC convention in May 2017. So he's a executive vice president. And he previously, he served at PSAC, which is the Public Service Alliance of Canada, as a regional executive, and also a regional vice president for PSAC. Larry's first experience in the labor movement, often Larry likes to mention that he started at the CLC. He was hired as a filing and stockroom clerk in the mailroom. And shortly thereafter, he was elected as a shop steward for the Office and Professional Employees International Union that we know as COPE for Local 225. And subsequently hired as at Statistic Canada. I don't know if there's any Statistic Canada branch, PIPS branch with us today, but if you are, what's up? And you know, say hi in the chat, because Statistic Canada's data is crucial in our fight, and often it's they are the data that we use to push the government to make these systemic changes. So keep doing what you're doing. And Larry, basically Larry is, has a certificate in civil law from the University of Ottawa, and also in the Faculty of Law. He has a master's degree also in public administration from École nationale d'administration publique in Quebec. Larry is somebody very passionate. I've known him now for a few years. He has a long history of trade union, political activism, and his involvement with the 2S LGBTQI and anti-racism and peace movement as an integral part of his work. And you are going to see that when he's going to address us. So Larry, please, thank you for being here and take us away.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. Thank you to the Institute. Thank you, PIPS, for having me here today. I really appreciate it. And after listening to that, Richard, I hear it quite often. In fact, I think I'm going to start taking Emilie's approach to say, you know what, enough with the biographies and those kinds of introductions. And you know, I ask people to say, hey, it's Larry, and I'm an activist, I'm a trade unionist. Yeah, but yes, I also happen to be an executive in the union movement, and that also is a huge responsibility these days, especially with what with Emilie was saying. regarding, you know, from the union perspective, the responsibilities and obligations that we have on our end to address issues of systemic racism. So first of all, yes, I'm coming from unceded Anishinaabe territory, and on this September 30th, I'm thinking of all my Indigenous sisters, brothers, and friends who will be hurting to hear about what happened to Joyce in Joliet. But let's be clear. This is not a one-off. Okay, this happens time and time again with our Indigenous folks across the country. And so I like to go back to the historical perspective. You know, why is it that whether it's Quebec or Ontario, Manitoba, when we look at how people treat our Indigenous folks, you know, it's systematic, it's systemic, and it is ingrained in our very culture. And why is that? From the very first time that the European settlers set foot here, and first of all, it was the fur trade. They took advantage of Indigenous folks, plying them with alcohol, you know, decimating communities with disease. And the fact is that after that, when England and France and Europe demanded our trees, our oaks, our pines, and then the land had to be cleared, well, they had to clear the Indigenous folks off the land as well. And they did that in any manner that was possible. And the population of the Indigenous folks on Turtle Island simply just went from, you know, declined by some estimates up to 90% over the course of a couple of 100 years. And once they cleared the Indigenous folks off the land so that they could have access to the resources of this amazingly resource-intensive country, I'm talking about Canada, but the United States as well, and the Caribbean and South America, all of Turtle Island, then they had to bring over my African ancestors, African captives, folks who were abducted, kidnapped, and they brought Africans here against their will so that the Africans would work for the white settlers. And we try to say that it's oh, well, that was in the United States, or it was mostly in the United States. Please go watch the episodes of the Book of Negroes. And even though they don't really get into the nitty-gritty of how the loyalists who did come up to Canada, you know, we need to unpack that a little more. We have a very romantic version of what the loyalists who were and who they were when they came up to Canada. But it is quite obvious from any research that the loyalists who left the United States because of the revolution down there, those who did have slaves, they brought their slaves with them. And they demanded that their slaves be brought with them, and they demanded that they continue to have their slaves as property. And that, it wasn't until early in the 19th century that Britain said, okay, in the colonies of Britain, we will eliminate slavery, but there were so many conditions. People who had slaves could continue to keep them, et cetera, et cetera. And what happened was, we are now also inculcating into the culture of the settler community, the white settler community, that Black people will always be subservient to white people. And then I always tell the story of how my ancestors, your ancestors, Richard, your ancestors, Emilie, our Black ancestors, our African ancestors rose up and revolted against the most powerful army in the world at that time, the army of Napoleon, and said enough was enough, and they declared Haiti to be an independent country. And I tell the story about how my father would say, when he would tell me when I was a young kid, how during the time of the upheaval, and this was a time that lasted for many years, 15 years, you know, the revolution in France also happened in Haiti, and people said, yes, fraternité, liberté, égalité. The black slaves said, we too must be free. And the plantations and the conflict for independence was such that when the plantations were burning, folks who were in the island of Bermuda to the north, many hundreds of miles north, would look at the southern sky and it would look like the western sky at sunset. That's how much the island was scorched and burned in order for black slaves to gain their independence. And ever since then, it has been a concerted effort on the part of all of the colonialist powers at the time. And even after the colonialist powers, soi-disant, gave the independence to countries, etc., right into the 20th century, to make sure that the Haitian experiment, that the experiment of black people and liberation of black people could not succeed, would never succeed. And we still see to this day that the experiment, the democratic experiment for black people in Haiti will not be allowed to succeed. And that is a shame, and I denounce it. And this is part of our systemic history, because even up here in Canada, white folks will not really understand the extent to which this oppression is onerous, is so hard on black people to experience day after day after day. And even when in the workplace, people will make light of race. People will say things like, you know, what François Legault said, that, you know, systemic racism, we don't have that here in Quebec. You know, these are the aggressions that brother Kimmeldin was talking about. Some of them are microaggressions and some of them are macroaggressions as well. But all of these things that are meant to keep people of color, especially black people, down. But so there is a lot to unpack. There's a lot to look at, and what we have to look at and what we have to start addressing is not only educating our members in the union movement, but making sure that the systemic issues that exist in our union movement are identified, number one, where are they, where do they exist, and that they are addressed. And that includes our conferences, that includes our training, that includes the way our locals are set up for elections and how we allow and invite people to participate. So there is a tremendous amount of work to do. I just, you know, as we talk about systemic racism, I just want to make a quick comment, because we're talking about, Emilie brought up, you know, Quebec, and it's complicated sometimes, and that also is a word that is used by the white establishment to say that it's difficult to achieve progress because things are complicated. And I just want to mention that when Premier Legault said that there was no systemic racism in Quebec, I voted on November 15th, 1976. I had just received my Canadian citizenship 2 months before that, and I voted in the elections. And I dare say that there was probably no one voting for René Lévesque in 1976 who would have disagreed that systemic racism existed in Quebec. And it came notably from the establishment of English colonialism. It was St. James Street. It wasn't St. Jacques, okay, in Old Montreal. Up until the 1950s, it was, and 60s, it was absolutely St. James Street, the financial capital of Canada. And we would refer to Westmount, the intellectuals would refer to Westmount as the Rhodesia, okay, of Quebec. So let's make one thing very clear. Not only did it exist, and not only does it exist, but when the English left Quebec, and I was there, I remember Haitians called, my cousin bought a place in Mont Royal in 1977 in the spring. Why? Because English people were leaving Montreal in droves because the French, they were going to separate, and we had to get out. We had to get back to, we're going to Toronto, we're going to Ottawa, okay? And when that happened, I remember how people were saying, you know, okay, bon débarras, goodbye the Anglos, etc. And then I would watch as French people would take up the vacuum of the establishment that was leaving, and that they would go and resort to the same practices, not against Francophones, not against their own French people, but against Indigenous people and people of color, and including Black people in Quebec. So, you know, there's a lot that we have to talk about. There's a lot that we have to do. And I'm really happy that we're having this discussion, okay? But getting back to the workers, Emilie is absolutely on point. We have migrant workers. Remember when we had people coming over Roxham Road, and how the racists were saying, "Oh my God, we're being invaded, we're being overrun. They're gonna come in. They're coming." And what was it? 95% of those folks were people of color, were Black folks. Okay, and so many of them were Haitians. And what happened? We hired those folks into jobs, and then COVID happens. And then the next thing you know, we have frontline workers who are cleaning, who are doing the maintenance work. And if anybody thinks that it's just because you weren't a worker who was directly involved with changing and cleaning our elderly in the long-term care facilities, well, guess what? They had to eat. Things had to be cleaned, and it wouldn't happen, and it couldn't be done unless those migrant workers were there doing it. And now we're saying that we're going to give these people over here status because they were actually directly involved in the work that had to be done. We're going to look at job descriptions. Okay, well, from a union perspective, I say shame, 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 and shame again. Those migrant workers were keeping our elderly folks, okay, clean, and trying to do the best that they could in a situation where everybody was simply, even the system, even the state did not know how to react in March and April and May. Even up to now, we have systemic issues that need to be addressed as far as long-term care is. And you're going to tell me that there is a migrant worker who cleaned, who cooked, who fed, who delivered, and because they did that, but because they were doing that work but not the other work, that they're not going to get status? Shame, shame, and I call it again. And I say, we have to correct this situation, and it has to be corrected immediately. And now you've got me on a rant, and I'm sorry, but let's get to the discussion. I want to hear what people have to say and what the questions are. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Don't be sorry for bringing reality and be passionate about what you're talking about, for sure. Just for the participant, if you have a specific, like, let's say you want your question to be specifically to one of our guests, you can put their name before your question, so I'll know who you want to ask the questions to. And also, beside in the chat, there's like two dots, and then there's like this arrow pointing down, you can choose ask a questions if you want to write the question directly to ask a question. So my first question will be to you, Emilie, from a participant. Can you talk a little bit more about the idea of where you're from? Yeah, we've all heard this, racialized. Even as conversionally and meant it in a friendly way as racist roots and meaning.
Yeah, actually I have Indigenous friends who are asked where they're from by a white person who's not from here, obviously. So it's interesting how it works. It's not that, it depends obviously on how it happens in conversation. When you're getting to know someone, I'll ask it to try to just, but usually when it comes up, it's very early in a conversation, as if the person needs to know that in order to figure you out, as if your origin was a way to make sense of who you are in a way that can be very problematic on one hand, but it's also the fact that a lot of folks who are white do not get asked that question at all, and they're assumed to be from here. And so that's the double standard, basically. If the curiosity was the same for people who are white, things would be different, but that's not the issue. The issue is that only people who are not white are being asked that. And it's interesting because on my mother's side, my father's from Haiti, my mother is French Canadian, from Quebec City, actually. So it's as my roots in Canada is as old as it gets for a non-Indigenous person. I'm asked where I'm from, and I get treated as a second generation person by people who are English Canadian who've been there for 2, 3, 4 generations, and for them they're just regular Canadian, right? So it's really interesting how that works, and there's so many different layers of absurdity to it. But it basically is who's being asked and how you're being asked. It's behind that question is the idea that basically some of us don't belong, some of us are from someone else. And the people who are deemed to be native of Canada or natural from Canada are people who are actually from Europe. And a lot of people who are Indigenous are actually read as being exotic, as if they were from some other place, either Asia or Latin America or something, which is all the more absurd as well. And so that's what I mean by that. And the last thing I will say about that topic is that, for example, here specifically in Quebec, there is, because of the history of discrimination against French Canadian, there's a lot of sensitivity around criticism that comes from outsiders. Either if it's, something that's in Quebec news, actually the story about Joyce Echapan, the Atikamekw woman, it was in the BBC, it's making international headlines right now. So whenever something like that happens, people sort of panic, right? The UK are talking about us, France is talking about it, the US is talking about us, but specifically whenever something is said coming from some of the Toronto media about Quebec, there's always a sensitivity that's going to come from a place of prejudice. And so when you have that sensitivity to outside perspective, which is actually very current in communities that have some sort of history of marginalization, but you add that to this perception that people like myself are not from here. That means, for example, that in my daily life, I receive so much more violence for being a columnist than my white peers, because even though I'm a Quebecer talking about Quebec society, I'm assumed to do it as somebody who's an outsider who should not have a say in the public sphere, right? And so it's this idea that we're all equal, but some of us are more equal than others, and that the idea of people who are not necessarily deemed to be from here are always, it's okay if we speak up to be thankful, to say that we love Canada, that we love Quebec, and that we're grateful to have been welcome here. But if that's not what you have to say, if you're being critical of society just like any other citizen, or if you're participating in society in both the good and the bad aspects of it, then it's like you don't know your place, right? Yeah. And so that's the toxic element of the where you're from question, actually, that when you put it together with the idea that some people are necessarily always coming from the outside or always new, are not necessarily well integrated yet. They are learning about our ways on one hand, and on the second hand, those people trying to speak up, you put those people in the boxes where you don't necessarily want to hear from them, except if they're saying, we love Canada, and oh, here's the story of my first winter. You know, so I guess this is how it is very subtle, but it can actually lead to situations that are actually harming our freedom of expression, if you think about it that way. Which is not to say you cannot be curious about other people's background. There's just,
yes,
that's not what I'm saying.
that's right. That's right. Yes, because I am very often curious about people's backgrounds. You know, I've lived in so many different places, I guess, you know, three neighborhoods in New York, lived in the country here in Quebec, Ottawa, you know, Montreal. So I'm always interested in knowing, like, who you are, where do your parents come from? Are they from Gaspé? Are they from Abitibi? How did they get up there? Because I'm a very big history buff. But there's a way of doing it, you know, so that you don't. It's not about who are you and what are you doing here, and how does that potentially threaten me and my position in society. That's what you've really got to watch out for.
Yeah, thank you. And Larry, to keep you going, I have this question from Emilie. How can the labor movement improve solidarity with the movement for defunding the police? And it is a very current conversation we're having right now, right? In a society, both in the States and Canada, and particularly when it comes to police unions, how do we ensure that unions do not stand in the way of dismantling a racist policing system?
Okay, thanks for that question. First and foremost, let's make something very, very clear. When we talk about trade unionism, I'm not talking about police associations. An association of employees, an association of people who work in a certain sector. So let's talk about the Canadian Bar Association. Let's talk about the engineers, the Society of Engineers. Let's talk about the Canadian Medical Association, the Quebec Medical Association. So when we talk about these associations, they are technically unions. They are structured in the same way. Their members get together, they elect executives, they negotiate the contracts and the schedules under which their members will be paid. So they are unions. And police associations, yes, technically are unions, but to equate police associations, all right, with, for example, the steelworkers, or to equate them with PIPS, or to equate them with the PSAC, or the United Food and Commercial Workers, hold on a sec. Let's remember that it has always been the role of the police from the very beginnings of this country, and as well as our European society, especially when manufacturing and when the capitalists became very much the owners of land and production, that anybody who rose up against that oppression had to be knocked down. And who did you use to knock that down? You had police. We started with private police that were the employees and the agents of the aristocracy and the capitalists. Then municipalities started to set up their own policing forces. But the first police were agents of banks. They were agents of the moneyed interests. And they were also agents of slave owners who were going after the slaves who had run away from the plantations. So it is very difficult to say, oh, the police have a union. Yes, it is a union, but please do not confound them and confuse them with the work that we are doing in the trade union movement. And I'm not saying that we are that the trade union movement is so much better, etc. We have our challenges, but you will notice that whenever there is a fundraising event, okay, let me take Ottawa as an example, but even Montreal, any city, when the police are making a fundraising event, you will never ever hear media or anyone refer to that association as the police union. But as soon as the shit hits the fan, okay, as soon as the president of that police union comes out and says, we're not gonna have an investigation, we're doing this, we're doing that, you know, then it becomes the union. And I find that the people who are anti-union revel in calling the police associations unions at that time, okay? But there is a huge difference. Now, there is a very interesting aspect, and that is, and I'll talk about PSAC, okay? The Border Services officers, okay, are in fact, you know, they're equated to police, but they're not considered police, all right? So, but they are they are Border Services officers to enforce the border, okay? And they belong to PSAC. I would not call the Customs and Immigration Union the same kind of a police association as we see for the municipal police associations, okay? Because that union falls under the Constitution of the Public Service Alliance of Canada. They come to the conventions and they do get involved with the good work of social justice, etc. It's difficult because Border Services officers have to work with law enforcement. However, and there are challenges, I'm not saying no, but there is a difference. And I just wanted to make that distinction. So police, how do we work with defund the police? Okay, first of all, as a trade unionist, I'll tell you that when I see a contract, all right, if I see something that says defund whatever, I want to know what it means, okay? Because we have to talk about what does it mean to defund the police? And I think that there is a consensus within the labor movement that defund the police means that we have to move the monies that were, you know, when you think about it, pre-9/11, 2001, the amount of police budgets represented a certain percentage of municipal budgets, okay? Most of those police budgets following 9/11 doubled. And in the years following 9/11, when police budgets come to the city for approval, it's usually a slam dunk, you know? Boom, there it is. Well, you know what? I don't think that we need tanks in the streets. I don't think that we need militarization, okay, of police personnel in order to maintain peace and good order in our communities. It's not right. So what we need to do is have this conversation to say, how are we going to take the budgets that have militarized our police and then put them back where they belong, so that when people have mental health issues, when we have community-based policing, when we have police who know the names of the people of the streets that they are walking up and down with, and not hiding in their cars, not wanting to have any contact with members of the community. And I've seen it, I've felt it, I've actually been there. Walk up to a police car and just want to knock on the window to say hello and been told to get the hell out of my face. You know, it's like, that's not policing. And I lived just down the street, for Pete's sake. When the people in the community make the effort to go forward and say, you know, we're going to reach out, and then the cops have to sit back and say, you know, you're bothering me. Really? I'm paying your salary. I pay taxes, and even renters, if you're renting an apartment, never forget a part of your rent is going to pay for the police budgets. Police work for us. Okay, that's what it's supposed to be. So defunding the police, let's get the police back to working for the people. All right.
So very true. And the whole fact about understanding what it looks like to defund the police is a crucial question. And hopefully the unions are going to sit down and have a concrete plan together to address that. Yeah, thank you, Larry. Jen, I saw you showed your video. You wanted to say something? Or?
Oh, I am just enjoying this like you wouldn't believe. I'm ready to hop off my chair right here. I am just like mind blown and watching the chat and people texting me through Facebook going, I can't get on. I just missed that. What did Larry say? What did Emilie say? And I'm just trying to catch up. So thank you, but we need to keep this going. So let's keep going.
Yeah.
All right. And I'll keep going with Emilie. Emilie, I have this question. And actually, I'm asking this to you both. Given the systemic oppression and silencing of racial issues in the public service, how can we encourage people to speak up and bring the issues forward? Given the about time that it takes to get to an independent board. So I guess it's a question basically concerning on the floor or in the public service, how can we bring issues either for others or for ourselves and don't have to go through this whole long process. And the whole aspect of proving that what's happening is actually racial discrimination and going through a process that is not the same as if the employer has transgressed a bargaining agreement clause or something like that. So what do you think about that?
First of all, I think that the fact that the burden of the proof is so heavy is not a coincidence. I think systems are designed to make it impossible to prove racism, either by having a very, very narrow definition of what it is, or a lot of what happens I'm seeing in different communities is you know, lumping everything into psychological harassment in a way that actually erases the specificity of racism that's going on at work. There's also ways in which systemic racism is hard to prove. For example, if you're looking for housing and a person just tells you that, you know, the building is already rented, you're not going to know that it's racism unless you get a white person to call in as well, and then you know the difference, right? So it's similar as well in the workplace, where you can be passed over for promotion a lot and you can have a sense in your guts that it's because racism, but if you're trying to do a formal complaint about that, you know, it's hard. And so the fact that the way that our system is designed is not necessarily the best way to address that. And so in all of our legal system, and just the way that Canadian or just Western, I guess, legality is designed is about individual cases. And so the route of you know, complaining individually and all of that is not necessarily the most efficient course of action if you're trying to achieve systemic change. If you want to do that, you know, there's individual cases for you. You need to find either justice for you, trying to have compensation for that, and that's a course. And there's a lot of limitation to that, to those steps, but they're not necessarily worth taking on. I'm just worth less. It's not necessarily worth less to take on, but I'm just saying it's complicated, especially if you have a union rep that is not actually aware of what racism is. So a lot of racialized workers have to fight on both fronts, right? It's like the employer who's doing something wrong, and also they have a union that's not up to pace in terms of how to accompany employees who have a complaint about that. But that's in terms of the individual case. But when you see that there's situations that are repeating themselves a lot, then it's more about policy change or trying to question the culture of the organization. And that's really hard to do if the only tool that you have is just individual complaint. And I'd say that the burden of neutrality and not speaking up, not being mistaken for an activism is something that I'm having a lot of conversations about, because it's also something that weighs very heavily on journalism, actually. So it's something that public servant and journalists have in common. This idea that you need to be incredibly careful about what you say, about not to be deemed as partisan or as not neutral, or that you need to be very careful about your online presence. Not me personally, because I'm doing opinion, right? But if you are a reporter, you can get fired for that. And just like when you're a public servant, you can get in trouble as well for saying things that are deemed political as well. So you need to be careful on those things. And the fact that there is this institutional silencing going on actually makes it more difficult for people to organize and to actually campaign to have those policy changes. One of the ways to achieve those when you're either a journalist or a public servant is through your union. But once again, your union needs to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And so this is why the conversation we're having now, for example, is so crucial. It's because people who are on the line are actually part of a profession that makes it even harder for them to actually speak up individually and just take on Twitter and be, this is what the racism I see in the workplace. So having unions who are on the ball on this is more crucial than ever in those kind of professions, in those kind of professional environment. And so to make sure that you have a sense of the workplace culture that can create systemic issues rather than just trying to address the complaints, and to develop that as a priority for a union also becomes crucial. So not only just being, on the receiving end, waiting for trouble to happen and kind of, address those fires, and instead look at the way that certain cultural elements within the public service actually systematically creates issues for people of color. One of them being always being seen as activisty or whatever when we're trying to bring perspective from our communities. So basically, instead of our insight being values and a way to actually be more in touch with what all the diversity of Canadians think, oftentimes it's characterized as something that is somehow against the professionalism of the employee or the public servant. That's one thing. The other thing is trying to always promote people who have a good fit with the culture, which is somebody who looks like the people who've been in place in that position before, who are most likely to be white, is also something that happens, this kind of good fit thinking that is heavily racially coded, although it's most of the time not thought of like that. So for people who are in managing position, trying to hire people, trying to find a good fit, usually this thinking will advantage white people. And so there's a lot of different things like that I'm seeing in different organizations that I'm doing contracts with, that it's just, it's so insidious, trying to have a very also fixed idea of what the necessary experience and background is for a position, and not being able to think that people could be promoted to that role or be able to do that job with a completely different trajectory. Is also a way in which we stall people of color, especially when they are not necessarily from this country, only relying on our personal networks in certain kind of position as well becomes an issue for sure when your networks are homogeneous. And so there's a lot of issues that are present in this, but that could also apply to any other work environment. But yeah, really the additional challenge is that you cannot speak up for yourself as a public servant without being deemed as a troublemaker. There's a culture against that, and so you need to have ways, you need to first of all acknowledge that and also find institutional ways around this so that it does not stop us from addressing systemic racism.
Yeah, thank you for the explanation. By the way, I want to thank the participant. The questions are coming in. There's lots of questions. Obviously, won't be able to go through to all of them, but we won't forget you. Like I said, we'll find a way to respond to most of your questions that are remaining. I think I have a question that Din wanted to ask or say something. I'll give you the mic, Din. See that.
Thank you. I have a question for Larry. Larry, what is CLC doing about anti-Black racism, both at the union affiliate level and with the employer, namely, for most of us, it's the government?
Yes, well, we are demanding, first of all, if we look at the federal government. So the CLC, you know, is a national body. So what we do at the CLC is we are at the federal government level. We have federations, provincial federations of labor. For example, Emilie is in Montreal. We have the Fédération des Travailleurs du Québec, the FTQ, that is a provincial federation of labor, and they do their lobbying at the provincial level, okay? So the work that we are doing is at the federal level. And number one, we are demanding that we have increased funding for the anti-Black racism strategies. And we are demanding that there be an action plan. And the strategy has to be made clear, because that has not been done yet. We know that they're working on it, and of course we understand that the federal government, you know, it doesn't turn on a dime, but we have to keep the pressure up, and we are keeping the pressure up. So those are two things that with the current government that we are doing immediately. Number one, double the funding for anti-Black racism strategies, okay? And number two, we absolutely need to see the strategy and the action plan. So it's not necessarily in that order. You need to have the strategy, you need to have the plan, and you have to make sure that the funding is going to go to achieving that plan. What we are doing in the field of anti-Black racism, of course, is declaring that we are in solidarity with the CLC, is in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. We believe that not only has Black Lives Matter, which started as a Black movement, but we have seen that Black Lives Matter has now rallied people across all races, genders, progressive people who want to come together, and that's what we want to encourage. We want to encourage folks who are not Black to come together and see that what Black Lives Matter is doing and the work that we have to do in identifying, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, identify the systemic barriers. Once we identify the systemic barriers, and this is what we have to do throughout society at all levels, whether it's capital, whether it's labor, whether it's government, those are the three economic sectors that compose this country. We have to identify the systemic barriers, and then we need plans and action on how we are going to address them and dismantle them. But more than that, what we are doing with our affiliates is that we are establishing education programs, because, you know, when we talk about barriers and when we talk about systemic barriers, it's one thing to identify them and talk about them, but if we don't look at culture change within organizations, within our workplaces, if we don't address the fact that you can have the best policies, you can have the best directives, you can have absolutely pickety-boo, wonderful, yes, and yet no one has the good faith, there is that trade union expression. If we don't have good faith participation and will in order to make sure that we are going to dismantle these barriers, it's not going to happen. So we have to absolutely have the education piece in place, but we also have to have the accountability mechanisms in place to make sure that we are constantly getting the data, disaggregated data, within our own organizations. We need to know how many Black members, how many members of color are in PIPS, in PSAC, the steel workers, etc. We have barriers there. We have to address them and we have to deal with them. And that's how we're going to. So we have to really get people into the mindset where they understand that when we say systemic racism, you're not going to do what Erin O'Toole did 3 months ago or 2 months ago and say it's not an issue. When you talk about systemic barriers, people have to be ready to have the conversation and not go like this and oh my God, I'm not a racist. I'm not a racist. You know, that's not what we're saying. That's not what anybody is saying. What we are saying is that we need to have the conversation and we need to have a good faith approach at all levels to make sure that we are addressing these issues. So, and that's what we are working towards at the CLC. It's the file for which I'm responsible.
Yeah,
it's not easy.
No, lots of work. Lots of work for everyone. For everyone.
3 million folks, 3/4 of whom are white. So, you know, it's going to be a slog. It's going to be a slog. It's tough, but we're going to get there. But, you know, one step at a time. It's a march, but we're going to get there.
Exactly. Thanks. Just to let you know, participant, that we'll ask questions until 4:30. So we'll end the webinar at 4:30.
Goes by so quick.
I know it does. You know, when we have good conversation like this. And I have an interesting question from Camille. As a younger person, I'm finding hard to be a good ally because of my lack of knowledge in the historical root of racism. I know that I have to learn on my own, but I'm wondering, how can I support your community in concrete ways? So we haven't talked much about allyship. Would you like to maybe tackle this one?
You know, Emilie, very quickly, I just want to jump in. I know I've been talking way too much, but I just want, it comes back to that what I was just mentioning about education, okay? Please go to the CLC website and go to our equity, you know, page and human rights, okay? So we have a page that's human rights, okay? Because human rights is the umbrella, all right? And we have to stop working in silos. We can't have someone working on anti-Black racism without talking about how the workers with disabilities are affected, because we have Black workers with disabilities. We have Black workers who are women, who are LGBT. So we have to make sure that all the conversations that we are having are representing the intersectionalities of our identity. So I just wanted to say that education is so vitally important. Go there. We have resources, and I'm sure Emilie is going to talk about resources as well.
Thank you, Kimmy, for your question. I don't think it's actually, you don't need to know that much about history to be able to be a good ally. Basically, you need to know what history tells you. And what history tells us is that systemic racism is embedded in the design of this country, and that we need to understand that when there are inequalities, they've been constructed, carefully constructed. They're not a coincidence, and that if we want to deconstruct them, we need to work hard at it. A lot of the time, we're taught history in a way that tells us the other way around. We're told history in a way that is about how Canada is a fair place, how Canada is somehow, yes, has a colonial background, but somehow exempt of colonization, how Canada is exempt from violence, right? And all of that. And so it's important in the workshops that I do to teach people about history, because they've been taught about history before. So it's a way to basically undo the damage, undo the misunderstanding that has been put in our brains since we were very young because of how we were taught the history of this country and how we believe certain ideas about Canada, right? So if you don't have those ideas, yes, you can go and as you read, and especially I encourage you to read more Black and Indigenous authors from this country. I think that's a really good way to do it. But as you do that, you just find more concrete examples, basically, of how systemic racism, what I was saying at the very beginning, how systemic racism is embedded into the fabric of this country. But if you understand basically the conclusion, the bottom line, that's really good to kind of help us move forward, because most of the time that's what we're up against. We're not up against an absence of knowledge of history. We're up against lies that we've been told about history. And so that's why we need to do the education on history is to undo the falsehoods. But if people were actually blank slates, things would be very, very much easier. But no, we're kind of like, all of us are starting in the negative, and we need to at least get back to the neutral zone before we start moving forward. And so, yeah, in terms of the other half of the question, how do you support your community in concrete ways? Well, I don't know where you're from, where do you live, and what are the issues going on in your communities, but I think people who are, locally around you are probably the best people to answer those questions. And so trying to figure out what the local issues are and who is part of those fights and who's organizing for those, and how basically you can help. And I find those questions about allyship very interesting, because a lot of them comes down to things that are very specific to each person's situation. And it's hard to give abstract advice on that. It's just a matter of basically knowing where you are, what your privileges are, meaning what power you have over certain, like in which way you could influence certain conversations, and in which community, in which campaign you could join, and what are your own personal strengths, and in which way in which you can be helpful. Basically, sometimes it's even your training as a professional that you can lend basically that expertise to a person. Sometimes it's your words, sometimes it's your network, sometimes it's your access, sometimes it's your money, sometimes it's your time. It very much depends on the person. But one thing I will say is that it is always easier to speak against exotic issues, issues that are far from your community, that you can be outraged about them, but don't actually have a lot of influence on them. I think that's one of the reasons why Canadians are so obsessed with American politics. It just makes us feel good at such a cheap price. But when you focus on the things you do have an impact on, and including reflecting on your own kind of relationship with people of color, whether or not they exist, and trying to ask yourself those questions in the history of your family as well, and how they came to this land and whose land are they on. I think this is when you start to have a line of questioning and learning that gets interesting.
PIPS and PSAC, we have fantastic courses. We have very good education programs, and allyship is something. So for example, my intersectionalities are that I'm gay and that I'm Black. Okay, so I think that it's important for people to realize that when you are an ally, I don't need you to come between me and the person who's insulting me. I don't need you to say, I'm going to defend you, Larry. Get out of my way. Some people think that that's what allyship is. It's not. It's to be there. If I need you, okay, I'll let you know. But I'm glad to know that you've got my back. All right? So that's what's important.
Very true. We're almost done, okay? Oh, Jennie?
Yeah, thank you both, Larry and Emilie. But speaking to the Black people who are here today, if we don't have a seat at the table, we can't make that change. And until we get that seat at that table, we have to push in order for us to get that seat. I, for years, sat back and watched everybody else did work at PIPS. First year, I put my name forward, I ran, I got a seat at the table. We're here today because I got a seat at the table. I need others to step up and take a seat at that
Yes.
table.
Thank you, thank you, thank you so much for bringing that up. You know, the first time I was the vice president of my local at StatCan, and I remember when I first ran for the regional executive vice president position, and someone came up to me and said, "Well, you know, Larry, I mean, you know, being Black, that's one strike against you, but being Black and gay, well, that's 3 strikes, you're out. You'll never win that." Well, you know, I did come in dead last, but I tell you, I put my head down and I found out, and 3 years later, I did win. I came in first, and that's what we've got to do. They will try to keep you down. They will try to keep you out. You get your folks out to the local meeting and you get yourself elected. And then after that, you build your base and you go forward. And that's how we're going to get a seat at the table.
Well
Thank
said. Well, things are coming in. Yeah, focus on things that you do have an impact on. It's so true.
Larry, they're calling you to run for president. I'm just saying. I mean, of the United States.
Oh, well, if you watch CTV tonight, you'll think that I was running for because I am involved. I cannot, you know, when this man stands up, and it's no longer a dog whistle. These are no longer dog whistle. This is a bullhorn. All right. He's a racist. He is a white supremacist. He is enabling these people. I'm done. I am so totally done. If you are an American in Canada, you have to vote. You have to get out there and vote. Votefromabroad.org. You get there and vote. This is no longer about Bernie Sanders and Biden and are we going to get health care? This is about, and this affects Canada, but it is who let the dogs out? I'm telling you, they're out and we are going to have to deal with them. And Emilie is absolutely right. It's a dark time right now, not only for the United States, but for Canada and countries around the world.
So true. So true. And again, thank you both for being here. I'll finish with this last question because I think it inspires a little bit of what can we do next. And there's some of that, right, that we need to talk about. There'll be other sessions as Jennie responded in the chat because we're doing a speaker series. But still, I mean, if we can start today, like doing a little work, doing a little bit more than we were doing yesterday, that'll be a good start. So Donna wants to know, there seems to be a real momentum now in society and within the workplace with respect to considering the experience and the rights of Black and Indigenous, I would assume. How do we keep this momentum going? My fear is that it will not last. What do we need to do? So basically, what the future looks like, what do we need to do, Emilie and Larry?
Vas-y, Emilie.
I share that fear that people have their other concerns. There's COVID-19, there's the environment, there's all of that. And I think one of the ways to fight the fact that we get distracted by other topics is by stopping to treat anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism as like specific topics rather than a part of every other conversation we're supposed to have. If we're having conversation about COVID-19 and not having conversation about race at the same time, we're kind of doing it wrong because we've seen actually some of the data that they didn't want to collect about how it affects Black people more, both in the United States and in Canada for sure. And so when there's the issue of who gets sick, but also who is risking their lives in the healthcare system, who are the frontline workers. And so it's all the conversations that we've had, for example, about COVID-19 that excluded the issue of race were fraud or flawed conversations. The same way that every time we have a conversation about economy in this country, trying to have how we're going to have economic recovery and not include indigenous sovereignty, and in those conversations have a huge dead angles and make them actually incomplete and false and irrelevant in many ways. And so the same thing whenever we speak about climate change and about the environmental crisis. And if you're having a conversation about gender that is not also about intersectionality, you're having a conversation about gender that is wrong. And if you're having a conversation about mental health that is not addressing the issue of racial stress and trauma, you're also having some dead end goals, and your mental health services will not be able to serve all the Canadian population. So I think one of the ways forward, and in all of your jobs as well, is to figure out, you know, the issues that you are working on. What is the dead angle that makes you not necessarily see the connection between what you do in your everyday life and the issues of racism that we've just been discussing. As long as these two will be separate boxes in your head, you will kind of like put it aside and go back to your everyday. But definitely for Black people, for people of color, for Indigenous people, there's no way for us to put our race aside and go back to our everyday, right? It's always on the front of our mind. And I think the challenge for people who are not racialized is to train themselves to do the same, and basically see how race impacts every aspect of their life, how their whiteness impacts every aspect of their life, and be conscious of that so that you don't basically put it back on the back burner because you've integrated conversation that should always have been integrated. And that's how you don't create an effect of fashion with the limited attention capacity that we all have as humans.
Larry? No?
I think Emilie said it all.
She said it all.
Yeah,
Yes, thank you.
That's great. It's just so fantastic to have Emilie on this panel. It's great. It really is.
You both. Thank you. And
Likewise,
thank
Larry,
you.
likewise.
Yeah. And thank you for the human rights to organize this. We're at the end. Thanks everyone for participating. Many questions again.
Good.
And I'd like to thank also the ones that we don't see that did help us organize this. I'm talking about Jill from communication, Shelley from organization, Andrea from communication, Malcolm from communication. There's a lot of people that help us create this webinar, and hopefully we'll have more. And again, thank you, Emilie. Thank you, Larry. Everyone have a nice rest of the day, nice afternoon. Thanks for being here. And the struggle continues, as we say, and keep up the fight. Thank you all. Take care.